This is Seeking Delphi, episode number 24, The Millennium Project and the State of the Future. I'm Mark Sackler. The future lives here. Is the glass half empty or half full? Of course, that all depends on your point of view. There's a tendency for many of us to see the entire human world as a glass half empty and deteriorating. For some, mostly of the techno-optimist variety, things will only get better. The glass will one day overflow. The reality, according to the Millennium Project, is essentially that the glass is simultaneously half full and half empty. Their annual State of the Future report finds plenty of improvement in many of the 15 areas that it studies, but imminent dangers in others threaten progress overall. Jerome Glenn is the co-founder and CEO of the Millennium Project, and I spoke to him recently about the 19th edition of the State of the Future. Jerome, welcome to Seeking Delphi, and thanks for joining me.
Nice to be here.
Jerome, let's start with finding out just a little bit about who you are, your development as a futurist, and your background, and what brought you to the point of founding the Millennium Project.
Well, I got into futures about 45 or so years ago, doing my master's, and I developed what's called futuristic curriculum development, and that got me running around the country talking about different things. And then I was offered, then did my doctoral work. First doctoral program, as far as we know, was the University of Massachusetts, and Chris Deedy was a co-founder of it, and he also started the program at Houston, by the way. But the doctoral program no longer exists at the University of Massachusetts now, but I was there. And I then took position with the Committee for the Future. It was very positive-oriented space development, new concepts, ideas. It was sort of the most far-out futurist think tank, I think. At the time, it was still connected to the reality. Then I created my own think tank called the Future Options Room for a while. And then I started running around the world with different organizations doing development and futures work, and then became a liaison for the United Nations University between the United States and its headquarters in Tokyo. And in that capacity, I was asked by Ted Gordon and the Futures Group if I could create this Millennium Project, which was going to be this big mega study on the year 2000 back in 1988. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted to create a mega system, not a mega study, because there are a lot of different studies. And so I had experience working at the Hudson Institute with Herman Kahn for off and on for about 10 years, and a lot of other sort of different futurists, and Ike Asimov, and wrote with him and some others. So I had a more general background in futures research than most, and international at the same time. So that gave me the ability to create the Millennium Project as a global participatory think tank. It was originally coming out of the UN University when I was inside that system. Then we eventually went independent and now have 63 nodes around the world and produced a bunch of different future studies and reports and methods.
So at this point, 20 years on, what would you describe the current mission of the Millennium Project to be?
Is to improve thinking about the future, quite simply. There's a lot of silliness or non-thinking about the future, and we're trying to improve it.
Well, that's simple, and it makes a lot of sense. Now, your primary vehicle for communicating the future to a broader public is a publication called The State of the Future. It so happens that my favorite quote about the future comes from that great icon of American arts and letters, Yogi Berra, who famously said, "The future ain't what it used to be." Now, we might laugh at Yogi's oxymoronic pronouncements, but in this case, he could literally be correct, because you've done 19 revised editions of this publication over the past 20 plus years. So clearly the future, in your viewpoint, isn't what it used to be. So what's changed? what's changed in the last year and what's changed over the course of the 20 years?
Well, I'd say that one of the things that's striking over the last 20 years is that we're doing a lot better than people think. We update data in this report, like what is the birth rate, the mortality rate, women in parliament, and all kinds of data stuff. And a lot of the data in human capabilities of education, welfare, and the general human stuff, we have done better than most people expected worldwide. We're living longer. Even whether you're in Nigeria or you're in Paris, we're living longer. We're better educated. We're more prosperous. I mean, rich as a civilization, but extreme poverty is down under 10% now. Whereas when we started this stuff, it was close to half the world was in extreme poverty. So we've done, and the population has grown as well during that time. So we're doing quite well in a lot of areas that people have no right to be pessimistic about. Now, we're also losing in some areas that are very dangerous, such as the environment, social stability, organized crime. We're not making progress in these areas, and they could wipe us out. One of the more recent, well, I guess not recent, we wrote about this stuff about 10 years ago, is that as humans become more powerful in their abilities to do things, to affect things at a distance, such as you and I are talking right now at a distance, this can be for good or bad. So we worry about the idea in 10 or more years that an individual may be able to make and deploy a weapon of mass destruction, be it biological or cyber or whatever. And so we're interested in trying to figure out how to prevent that. We can go into that if you want to, but that's a bit of detail. So I would say one of the recent things is certainly the political instability that is beginning to be nurtured by the current administration. The unsureness of the global conditions, this may be a phase that passes, but that's certainly, you asked about the last year, what has changed. That's one of the big things that has changed in the world. We did see trends from the first, let's say, 15 years of our work in the Millennium Project, that democratization was increasing and stabilization was increasing, refugees were going down, there were fewer, almost disappearing trans-border wars. But now that's beginning to reverse again. So you've got less press freedom and murdering of journalists is going up. Internal instability in countries has gone up with international involvement to some degree. So the instability is an increasing phenomena we're seeing that can be turned around, and most of the world is perfectly fine. I just got back from El Salvador a couple of days ago, and most people are nervous wreck about my going there, saying, "Oh, you're going to be shot." Well, you walk around, but most of what you see in the world is perfectly fine. Most people are treating each other in a nice way. But understandably, we take a look at those things that are problems, and we tend to think that that's the big picture, and that's not. The big picture is we are winning as a species.
Jerome, now to move on to the organization of the report, there are two main sections. Global challenges, you have 15 of them, and those have apparently remained the same throughout the 20 years this report has been issued. And then there's something called the State of the Future Index, which quantifies or attempts to quantify the progress or lack thereof across all human endeavors. And the input to that does change over time, if I read this correctly. So start with the 15 global challenges. How are they selected, and which ones are doing better? Which ones are doing worse?
Well, when we began back in, we had the 3-year feasibility study, by the way. And even before the 3-year feasibility study, we had a 1-year pre-feasibility study. And even before that, we scratched our head, is this even possible to do? So we didn't actually begin operations until 1996. And we began with a questionnaire going out around the world to various futurists that we selected during the feasibility study, and saying, what's going on now that's going to become a very big deal in 25 years, and what's it going to look like in 10 years, and give me some references. So they wouldn't just sit down and invent something. It had to be something tangible that we're misunderstanding coming up in the future, or that we were sort of oblivious to the significance of it. So we collected, I don't know, about 100, over 100, maybe 150, I've forgotten the exact number, of what we call developments. So they could be trends, they could be events, they could be policy decisions, because we were working in a lot of different languages around the world. So it's real easy to have things misunderstood. So we use sort of like generic terms and don't know whether it's a trend or an event or a policy, whatever. We're trying to collect the thinking around the world of the informed thought leaders. Then we took these and we collected interviews and more questionnaires and long process over the course of a year, and ended up with 15 global issues. And our planning committee, composed of some futurists and node chairs around the world, said, that's very cool, but you landed like a bunch of engineers looking for problems. What about the opportunities? So we did the same process the next year and ended up with 15 or so opportunities. Then the third year, we put them together into 15 challenges. And our friends from Finland said, look, we're evaluating our country based upon this framework. You can't keep changing all the time. So we kept the 15 challenges more or less up to the present day. We did merge 2 decision-making challenges into one and then opened up education. We didn't have education before because education was a strategy in all the challenges. But because the development of understanding of the brain recently has changed so much, and artificial intelligence is expanding so much, the merging of artificial intelligence and brain research is going to totally change education, that is such a profound difference for humanity that we figured, okay, that ought to be a challenge all by itself. So that's the one we changed. We've kept all the rest of them more or less the same.
While change in most of these 15 challenges might to some extent be quantifiable with objective data in areas like climate change, wealth gap, access to clean water, etc., I look at something like global ethics and wonder just how you can quantify that. So how do you measure it?
Yeah, well, we don't. We don't have a one-to-one correlation on all of this. We do the best we can, and you're right, the ethics is hard. We can infer that from some of the other challenges, such as the development gap, such as the number of women in parliament. So there's other things. So we get at it indirectly. We might want to start to look at the International Standards Organization, because that's a participatory global process that's creating the ethics of the future of civilization, essentially, which is pretty unknown in the United States to a large degree, but a lot of other countries are aware of it. And we haven't figured out a right way to measure that. So we're struggling with it. So you're right. We don't have a good measure for ethics.
Moving on now, Jerome, to the State of the Future Index. This appears to be substantially more complex than the 15 challenges, and the inputs are more numerous. They do seem to change over time. So just what goes into this, and how does that bring you to the conclusion that things are still actually overall, if at a slower pace, getting better for the outlook for humanity?
Well, what we do is we take these indicators and say, okay, what do you measure for that? And then we have to get 20 years of data to have the right, in our judgment, to project out 10 years. We just made up a 2-to-1 ratio. There's nothing religious about this. And so then when we put that together, then we send out a questionnaire to people and say, okay, if this is the 20-year trend and 10-year projection, so a 30-year spread on this variable, what might it be if everything worked well? What's the best possible value for this variable in 10 years? And then we collect all those numbers, and that becomes an average good of all the respondents. And then we say, okay, at the same time, the same questionnaire, saying, okay, what's the worst possible value for this variable in 10 years? So then average all those answers. So that gives us a range between good and bad, through which we can project the 10-year trend. And so we can then add up all these different variables together, because where they're in common, to normalize the mathematics, as it's said sometimes in mathematics, is how much to the good are we? And so each one is how much to the good are we? and that gets added together into an integrated index.
Getting back to the challenges, I note that for each of them, you have a list of recommended actions to get to a better outcome or a desirable outcome. But in order to do any of that, there's a need for public awareness. That's what my mission is, to be an advocate for more and better foresight in humanity through blogging and podcasting. How do we get to that? What are you guys doing, if anything, to get to that level of awareness?
Boy, there's so much to be said about that. We, in the Millennium Project, do a little bit of public outreach, but not as much as probably we should. I'm pleased to see the New World Future Society is more interested in doing public outreach and public general PR, so to speak, than a lot of us. I see the Millennium Project more as doing the difficult futures research work that other people can translate to the public for public education. I mean, someone's got to do the hard, research work as a core work that other people pull out what they want to. We can think of us like a utility, and people pull out different things that they want to. Public involved in the future is far more important today than it ever was before. The individual has the means of production with the internet that we did not have in the industrial age, because the individual did not have a factory. They worked in a factory, but they didn't own a factory, the average person. But now every individual is the center of a market that has half the world. 52% of the world is connected to internet now. So public opinion, for better or for worse, is more powerful than it used to be. And this brings us into all the information warfare and fake news stuff that we're drowning in right now. In the past, you didn't have much communication levers, so there was a much better control on it. But now that it's wide open. BS is treated as equally as sage philosophy. As a matter of fact, probably sage philosophy is treated less with respect than bullshit today, and that's a serious problem. But the public will increase its power. In a sense, like religion was like the original organizational structure for society. Then governments grew on top of that. Didn't replace religion, but sort of grew new kinds of power on top of that. Now corporations are growing beyond government power. And eventually individuals will even have more power to manipulate and move around than corporations. We're not there yet, but that seems to be the direction. So yeah, the public understanding, public knowledge is going to be far, 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 far more important in the future, because the individual and the public has more power than it used to, for good or for evil.
In addition to the challenges in the index, there's a third section in the current edition of State of the Future, and it deals with the future of work in the automation age. Obviously, that's one of the hot subjects out there right now, and not just among futurists. You provide three different scenarios, a good, a bad, a kind of mixed bag middle ground, which may be closer to where we are now. Tell us about how they were put together and what they look like.
Most scenarios that people refer to are not scenarios. They're discussions of future assumptions and future possibilities and data projections. I mentioned before that I spent 10 years with Herman Kahn, who invented these things. And the idea is to find out what you don't know about the future that you should know, but you didn't even know that. So how do you find out those unknowns, so to speak? You write a story from the present to the future condition, and as you write it, you get to a point you say, oh my God, I have no idea what happens next. So you stop writing and then do research. And that's what these scenarios are. These are detailed. Each scenario is 10 pages of cause and effect links. How did this happen? Well, how did that one happen? How did that one happen? And illustrates decisions and cause and effect links to expose the assumptions that we make about the future. The way we did this is we started off with a real-time Delphi, sending out the invitation to our 63 nodes around the world, and then they would in turn send the questionnaire on to various experts and futurists until we collected data about technologies and economics and employment, and to see what was important about all of that. Then they took all that massive information and then assume if this stuff goes good, what does it look like? If this stuff goes bad, what does it look like? And if it's a mix, what does it look like? So then that came came up with 3 scenario drafts. We sent then each scenario draft as a separate real-time Delphi to critique, go through, and change. And then based upon that feedback, then we made the final scenarios.
Well, I've had all sides of that question represented in previous podcasts here on Seeking Delphi. I'm curious to know where you stand on it. Automation, AI, robotics, and jobs. How do you feel, if you have your own opinion, or have you remained agnostic?
Well, I think it's important to make a distinction between 3 different kinds of AI. The conversation about AI, in my mind, is just terribly muddled. What we have today is narrow AI. Yes, that can increase to some degree some sort of employment, but it also can decrease some. But that's narrow. You can't use the AI that you use for diagnosing cancer. You can't use to drive a car. The AI that you use to drive a car cannot win in AlphaGo. Those are narrow. That's what we have today. We may or may not get to general intelligence, artificial general intelligence, and that's a big impact on employment. Narrow, as you would think, would have narrow impacts in different areas. But general intelligence is not exactly like your brain, but it's similar in the sense that it can adapt to a new situation and look around for what you need to know in order to make a good decision. So general intelligence, if it comes by 2030 or 2035 or whatever, that will draw on the Internet of Things. It'll draw on all kinds of sensor networks around the world. It'll draw on other people's intelligence systems that are available. Masses and masses and masses amounts of data, way beyond what we have today. And that can have a real big impact on employment. So when you interview people, you should ask them, are you talking about the impact of narrow intelligence or general intelligence? Because they're completely different phenomena. It's like confusing the fax machine with the internet. So the next one is artificial superintelligence, and that's general intelligence that sets its own goal. And that's what Elon Musk is worrying about. That was Hawking's. A lot of people are worrying about that one in science fiction. And so you have to have general first. And we don't know, the reason people are worrying about it is that we don't know how long it'll take to go from general intelligence to superintelligence. You know, we could be a day, it could be never. We don't know. But by its nature, we wouldn't necessarily know because it would be beyond our understanding by its definition. So back to your original question, am I optimistic or pessimistic about it? We're doing workshops all around the world. We've done 19 or 20 countries already, where we take all these discussion points, these scenarios, we give the scenarios to people, they read them ahead of time. Then they come to the workshop and says, okay, what do we do about this in business? What do we do about this in government? What do we do about this in education? What do we do about this in culture and arts? What do we do about this in science and technology community? And then come up with national strategies. And then we put all these strategies together and then send them back out and on an ongoing basis. So my attitude on this is we got to get damn serious about this. And it don't have to panic right now. You'll have time to think it through, but we have to think it through. And we have to make these distinctions between narrow, general, and super, and then see how those things will affect across the board. I agree that areas like synthetic biology and other biological areas could be tremendous growth areas for employment. But at the same time, you may see in that scenario 3 that we may have a self-actualizing economy eventually, so that you sort of make a living out of being yourself, a little bit like you're doing right now. Now, I don't know how much living you're going to make this, but for example, we are both curious about the future. And so that's how we're organizing our life. We're creating this. We're inventing this as we go. And more people will be able to do that compared to the past. So that will be a big income area for people, but that's not employment in the traditional sense.
So one final question, Jerome. When can we expect the 20th edition of the State of the Future?
I don't know. I keep telling people that they should subscribe to the Global Futures Intelligence System, which is vastly more than the State of the Future. The State of the Future is just like a thumbnail sketch of some of the stuff that's in the Global Futures Intelligence System, because there we have all of our research, we got all of the methods in there, we got much more detail on each of the challenges. We've got new services that are coming in. We've got scanning systems. We've got Delphis that people can run. There's a series of books on each of these things. It's just a giant system. And I would like not to write any more State of the Futures. What I'd rather do is just have people learn how to use the online system. That's a better deal. So that's my preference, but I get talked into writing these things several times. I thought that the last one was going to be 2011 or 2012, but I get overruled from time to time.
Jerome, this is great stuff. Thank you so much for your time, and best of luck moving forward with the Millennium Project.
Thank you. Good luck to your podcast as well.
Heard out of context, Jerome Glenn's assertion that we are winning as a species could be taken as the pronouncement of a Pollyanna. But the true message is that we are doing better in many areas than most people realize. However, extreme challenges in places like the environment, political stability, and organized crime loom as dark clouds on the horizon. The Global Futures Intelligence System can be accessed online at themp.org. That's THEMP.org. Links to pages relevant to this program can be accessed at www.seekingdelphi.com. Don't forget that you can subscribe to these podcasts on iTunes, Player FM, and YouTube, and you can follow us on Facebook. Thanks for joining me. Until next time, I'm Mark Sackler.